Well, how many of you guys have read the books or seen the movies, The Lord of the Rings? Anybody seen these, read the books? I have seen the movies and I've read one of the books, and I'm not brave enough to go through all of them just yet. But I love the movies. They're great. I got the extended version. They're already too long of movies in the first place, but I got the 5-hour long version of the movies, and they're long, great movies. But I'm going to talk about one of the kingdoms in that, in this world, in this realm that J.R.R. Tolkien created. There's this one nation named Gondor. This is a nation of men, this great nation it's the biggest nation of men. It's the greatest nation in the lore of The Lord of the Rings, whatever this world is. And they're doing great, but then whenever we pick up in the story, when we first meet them, Gondor doesn't have a king anymore. They just have a steward on the throne. It's just some guy that they appointed that said, well, we don't have a king right now, but you can help lead us for a little bit of time. And he's not a true king, and because of that, the kingdom starts to divide a little bit, and they start to lose their former grandeur, and they kind of fall apart, and they get divided, and they're always in war, and things aren't going that great for them, and it's just a tough time because all this economy is going down for them, and they're just a bleeding nation, a struggling nation that's just barely staying alive. And the reason I want to talk about Gondor is because it's very much the story of Judah, and also very much the story of God's people even today, where these people in 700 BC and in 2000 AD, they love God and they're a great nation, but then sometimes they feel like they're bleeding and they're just dying and they're beaten up and at war and just not having a good time. Now in Judah, 700 BC, these people, the reason that they're so much like Gondor is they don't have a king. They just have some governor, some steward to stand in the place. They don't have much going for them. They've been slaves and they've been in war and things are going down. But then Zechariah, he's this prophet, and he gets this message from God. And he gets a message that's opposite of what they would expect to hear. And here's what the message is. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, is he humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, on the foal of a donkey. He says, rejoice, shout aloud, sing for the king. He says, look, your king is coming your way. You need to rejoice that fact. Things are going to turn around for you. It's going to be great. And he tells them to sing for this king that's going to be showing up to them here soon. Now, if you guys haven't picked up on it, this is obviously a prophecy about Jesus Christ. We saw this back on Palm Sunday. Jesus Christ comes in riding on a donkey into Jerusalem, and he is a humble king. He's the donkey king that we looked at. This is the prophecy, Zechariah 9:9, that points to that way back when, hundreds of years before Jesus is around. And it's this same idea, sing for the king, rejoice, shout aloud, tell everybody, and worship this king that's coming. Sing for this king. And what we're going to see in the next few verses, verses 10 through 13, we're going to see 3 reasons to sing for the king. 3 reasons to shout aloud and rejoice. 3 reasons to worship this king and to worship God, that is our creator. And so the first one is this. Sing for the king because peace is coming. Now, for these people, they've been in war, they've been in battle, they've been enslaved, and they've been attacked and beaten up, and it's bad for them. I mean, how many weeks are we into this? We're 5 months into Zechariah. Have you gotten the idea that things are rough for Zechariah, for his people? They've been in constant battle and constant attack, and it's bad for them. But then we get this little part that Zechariah adds after. Verse 10, I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall speak peace to the nations. He says, I'm going to take away all of these weapons of war, because this war horse and this chariot and the battle bow, those are the big 3 of ancient battle. Those are the big 3 of ancient warfare. That's what you want to have on your side, but God says, I'm going to cut it off. You're not going to have it anymore. It's going to be cut off. It's going to be taken away, and you're not going to have the chariot, the war horse, or the battle bow. This new king, he arrives, and he takes away all of these things. Now notice, this king doesn't take away the battle bow and the chariot and all these things from Persia and from Babylon and all these pagan nations that are against them, all these nations that are enemies. No, he doesn't take it away from them. He takes it away from Ephraim and from Jerusalem. from God's chosen people. He says, you're not going to have any more war, any type of weapons used for war. You're not going to have any of this. Now, Ephraim is the northern tribes. And if you guys don't know a little bit of history of Israel, Israel used to be one nation back whenever Moses brought them in. And then sometime after, when they had some kings, they split into two. The northern half is Israel. The southern half is Judah. Judah's the good guys. That's where Jesus is from. We like Judah. And Israel rebelled, and they don't have any good kings during this divided kingdom time. And they don't really like anybody else. They're kind of against Judah. So Ephraim, it represents this northern kingdom, this rebellious nation, God's people who are rebelling against God and think they're right and don't really want to hear Judah's side of the story. And then we see Jerusalem, which represents God's chosen people. That's the remnant. That's the last few that stay faithful to God that He has chosen. And He says, I'm going to be with you. But God says, I'm going to take away the war horse from you guys. I'm going to take away the chariot. And I'm going to take away the battle bow from my people. He doesn't take it away from the enemies. He takes it away from His own people. But then He adds on, He shall speak peace to the nations. He says, not only will you guys not have any warfare things, He says this idea of peace, this idea of not being in battle, not being in war, will spread to the entire nations surrounding you. And He adds on the last part of verse 10 to reemphasize this. His rule shall be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Now, from sea to sea, we hear that term a lot because we have the song, I'm not going to sing it because you don't want to hear me sing, from sea to shining sea. We get this idea where it's covering all of the land. This king's rule, it's going to cover the entirety of the land on earth. Whenever this king shows up, whenever Jesus shows up, His rule, His kingdom, is not going to be just for Jerusalem. It's not going to be just for Judah. It's not going to be just for Israel. It's going to be from sea to sea, every place that there are people, everywhere that people live, anywhere there's a land, His rule, His sovereign authority will be shown. His rule will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Now, this river, capital R up there, maybe, yep, capital R, this river is the Euphrates River. And this automatically calls us back to the Garden of Eden because back in Genesis, check it out, there's 4 different rivers that outline what the Garden of Eden is. Inside these rivers is where the Garden of Eden is, and one of those is the Euphrates River. And so it shows where God first chose to put people, this king's rule will start there and spread out throughout the rest of the world. It will infect the rest of the land everywhere else. He starts out here in the Middle East, but then it's going to spread out to everywhere else. This king's rule, it's not just for one nation. It's not just for one city. It's for each and every person who has ever lived and will ever live, and it will spread to every nation. And this peace is a time of non-warfare, of everybody living together in communion and not being upset, not being angry with each other. It is a beautiful time that is unheard of, unseen before, of this worldwide peace. Now, can I tell you guys about my sister, Keturah? She's 5 years older than me, 5 times meaner than me. Have I said that before? She is the meanest one out of my family. She's a brat. She knows it. She's a little sweeter now. Nice of her. But she is rotten to the core whenever she's 10 years old. And whenever we were little, on Sunday nights, we would go to our kids' stuff at the church, and my parents would go to their small group or whatever it was on Sunday nights. But we lived right down the street from the church. So whenever we got done with our youth group stuff, we would walk home, and it would just be the kids at home, and my parents are still at their small group. And that's a dangerous combination because Keturah likes to be mean, and she likes to be mean to me, especially whenever nobody's there to punish her for that. I remember distinctly she would like to torment me in a cruel way. Whenever I was a young lad, she would come home on Sunday nights and she would turn on The X-Files. You guys seen The X-Files? It's an interesting show, but for a 6-year-old, it's terrifying. I don't want to watch The X-Files when it's dark outside and I don't know what's going on because there's monsters in there. That's a little scary. But she would watch that and we would fight and we would bicker and we would get into a skirmish. But we knew whenever Mom and Dad got home, there's going to be peace in this household. And that's going to typically come by spankings, but that's all right. They're going to bring peace to this household, and we're not going to be fighting whether or not we want to or not. Whenever my parents come back, they will bring peace to our house. And in the same way, whenever Jesus shows up, whether we want it or not, He's going to speak peace to everywhere. There's going to be peace on this earth like we've never seen before. Sing for the King, rejoice, shout aloud, worship Jesus Christ, because peace is coming. Now we're also going to see sing for the King, because restoration is coming. Now for these people, again, if you haven't gotten the idea, they're broken down. This is a horrible time. They have nothing left when they come back to their holy land, and they're trying to rebuild. They're trying to make something of their lives. They don't have any money. They don't have any house. They're struggling, but God says, I will restore you. Sing for the King, rejoice, shout aloud, because restoration is coming. Here's verse 11 where Zechariah gives this a little bit. As for you also, he says, now I'm going to make my attention on you, specifically on Judah, because of the blood of my covenant with you. I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Now that as for you also is a really weird phrase. I think it's better translated as, now my attention is on you. Because before, when he was talking about peace, he's saying that's for everybody. That's for the entire world. That's spreading from sea to sea, from the river on outward. And he says that's for the entire earth, but now I'm going to focus my attention specifically on God's people. That's what he does here. That's what as for you also means. He says, now I'm going to look at Judah, look at Jerusalem, look at Ephraim, my people, my chosen people, God's people. I'm going to focus on you. And he says, because of the blood of my covenant with you. Now, blood of the covenant, that's something that's not really said again until Jesus shows up and at the Lord's Supper. He says, this is the blood of my covenant. Now, this refers back to the covenant that God makes with Moses. Remember back when Moses is first getting the law and he gives them all the Levitical law and everything. Here's how to do this. There's a whole lot of blood involved in that because people are sinful and people deserve, God demands payment for our sins, and that comes in the form of blood. And the covenant that he made was that they could sacrifice animals, goats, rams, bulls, these things, and they could sacrifice those to atone for their sins. And he says, the blood of my covenant with you, my promise, my agreement, my contract with you, because of this, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. And that waterless pit, it really gives you a nice, vivid image of what's going on. Because out in the country out here, we have a few wells. Anybody on well water where they live? Neat. So I got some friends that are on well water, but if a well dries up and you toss somebody down in the bottom of a well, it's just a dry cistern that's, however far deep. You're not getting out of there pretty easy. You're going to die almost certainly in the bottom of this well that has no water that you can't climb out of. That's the situation that these people are in. And it recalls back to Joseph whenever his brothers are jealous of him and they're ticked at him. And so they sell him into slavery. But before that, they toss him down into this dry cistern, this waterless pit. It spells certain death for anybody who's left there. And it is certain doom. And that's what Judah is in because they've been enslaved and they've been taken away by the Babylonians. And they are in a waterless pit. There's no hope for them. It's not even worth thinking about getting out because they know they can't get out. But God says, I will set them free. I will bring them up out of the well. They will be freed from the waterless pit. You can have hope. And then he adds on even this part, verse 12. Return to your stronghold. Return to Jerusalem. That's the stronghold, the high-walled city that God protects. And he says, not prisoners of the waterless pit anymore. He says, prisoners of hope. Because today I declare that I will restore you to double. So not only does he take them out of the pit, but he says you can now have hope. You are slaves not of the waterless pit, you're slaves of hope. You have something to look forward to. And that hope isn't just, man, I hope one day that'll happen. That is, you know for sure that's going to happen and you're just waiting for it to happen. He says, you are now prisoners of hope. You now know for sure that I will restore you and bring you back to being whole. And then he says, I will restore to you double. And this reminds me of Job back in the Old Testament where God allows Satan to take away everything from Job, just not his life. Takes away his family, his possessions, his money, his wealth. And then at the end, afterwards, God says, I'm going to restore to you double what you had. You were a rich man before, and now you're going to be even more wealthy. You're going to be flourishing even more. I'm going to restore to you double. And that's what God does for these people. He says, I will restore to you double. You're not going to be the way you were before. Things were good back then with Solomon and David. Those were great, but that's not as good as it will be. Whenever the King comes back, whenever Jesus Christ rules this world, he's going to restore his people not just to where they were before, not just to a good place, but to the best place, to a double blessing place. He says, I will restore you and bring you back. Now, you ever notice sometimes in movies and TV shows when they depict a mental hospital, everybody's got the straitjacket on and they're all there against their will. Everybody's seen this. We all know what I'm talking about. I looked up some facts on this, and as it turns out, they got some things wrong in that. Because the majority of people that are in mental institutions are there because they checked themselves in. Did you guys know that? Most of the people, there are some that are against their will because they need to be, but most of the people are there willfully and because they want to be there. Because they recognize that they're in this waterless pit. They recognize that something's not right, and they say, I want to get better. And so they check themselves in and they say, I want to be better. Can you help me? And so that's what we see with Judah. They're in this waterless pit, but they want to get better. They want to be restored. And this king, that's what he brings. He brings restoration for these people, and it's going to be even better than it was before. So we see, sing for the king because peace is coming. Sing for the king because restoration is coming. And lastly, sing for the king because unity is coming. Now again, we're going to go back to this. Ephraim and Judah, they used to be one nation, and then they split off. They separated. Ephraim and the northern tribes of Israel, they go off and they do their own thing. And then Jerusalem and Judah and the southern tribes, they go off and they do their own thing. And even worse than that, whenever Babylon comes along to these already broken nation and these already broken tribes, and they break them down even more and shatter them and take them away, and it's rough for them. But now look at what happens. Verse 13. I have bent Judah as my bow, and I have made Ephraim its arrows. Do we got any bow hunters out here? Bow hunters? Didn't think so. Neat. I've never been either. But I know a little bit about bow and arrow, a little bit about archery. If I just have a bow, what good is a bow? Well, can you do anything with a bow other than smack somebody with it? It's not going to do any good. What good can you do with an arrow other than run up to the deer and try and stab it? Not much. You need a bow and an arrow together to be able to work, right? We understand that. We get that imagery. And he says, oh, Jerusalem, he doesn't say Jerusalem's going to be my bow and arrow, and then Ephraim's going to be my sword. No, he says Ephraim will be an arrow, and Jerusalem, Judah, will be a bow. You can't have one without the other. They both have to be used in conjunction together for anything good to happen. And so God says, I'm going to use you together, not separate, not away from each other anymore. You guys need each other to complete each other to be able to do this task that I have set before you. He takes two enemies, unites them in a way that they must use each other, and they can accomplish a great task. And then he adds this part. I will stir up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and wield you like a warrior's sword. Now, God uses these people to go against Greece. Now, Greece is an up and rising nation at this time. They're not quite the powerhouse that they will be, but they're getting there. They're a notable nation at this time. And the reason that they're notable is that whenever Babylon takes us off into slaves, whenever Babylon takes the Jews away, they sell them off to Greece. And Greece takes them and buys them as their own slaves. And so Greece has some Jewish slaves in its nation. And so God says, I want my people back, and he's going to go up and take his people and go get his people and bring them back. That's what he does. That's why he uses these people together. And another thing to look is that throughout this verse, throughout these verses, he's talked about Zion and Jerusalem, which is God's holy mountain. But then when he's talking about specific people, he talks about Ephraim and Jerusalem, or Ephraim and Judah, two separate people. But instead, he doesn't say, I will stir up your sons, O Ephraim, and O Jerusalem. No, he says, I will stir up your sons, O Zion. You as a collective group, you as a whole, you're no longer two separate ones. You're one that is now named Zion. You are one nation united together. That's what you are, and that's what you will be. And he takes this united group, and he goes up to Greece, and he brings back the slaves, brings back the people, and he unites all of the broken nations and all of the stolen nations, and he says, you are one. Now, whenever I was a little kid, I didn't have cable. I didn't have DirecTV or anything. I had 8 channels and 2 PBS stations, 2 Fox stations, and that's NBC, CBS, and that's about it. And that was a good life. But as a result of that, I didn't get to watch cartoons that much, only on Saturday mornings, which I love that show. There was too many of them. I think Woody the Woodpecker was one of my favorites, but that wasn't on for too long. But all of these Saturday morning cartoons I used to love. But one of the shows that I remember watching which is always on at the very tail end of all of the cartoons, was Power Rangers. You guys know what Power Rangers is? Because you have little kids, I hope. Power Rangers is a derpy show. It's ridiculous. It's horrible acting, but for a little kid, it's a whole lot of fun because I get to see some kids in latex suits punch some other people. Loved it. But in Power Rangers, almost every episode followed the same formula. Bad guys show up, and then the Power Rangers go and fight them, and one of two things: either they'll beat them pretty easily, or they'll get beat, and then at the end of the episode, a bigger foe will show up, or all of the foes that they fought earlier will show up with a big tank or a big Godzilla suit or something like that. And then the 5 Power Rangers separated can't do anything. They can't beat this one big mean guy. Instead, what they have to do is they get in their Megazords, they get in their Dinozords to make the Megazord, and they all unite together in this giant robot that is a collaboration of all 5 of their abilities and all 5 of their suits and all this. And they put it into one thing, and then they can go and fight this big bad guy and take them down. You see, that's what God does with us, with His people. He takes us when we're separated, when we're divided, and we're separated across congregational lines and across city streets, and He brings us back together so that we can go and defeat anything, and He can use us to take down anybody who stands in His way. And He says, sing for the King, because unity is coming. If you guys want to come up and play, I want to go back. I forgot a verse up there. That's all right. I'll skip it. I want to go back to Lord of the Rings for a minute. So we see this nation Gondor. They're without a king, broken down. They don't have any peace. They don't have any unity. They don't have any restoration. They're all in shambles. They're in the same state that we are sometimes. They're in the same state that Judah is in sometimes. But a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings. In case you didn't know, was a Christian and really close friends with C.S. Lewis, who wrote many great books like Mere Christianity and the Screwtape Letters and the Chronicles of Narnia. And the two of these men, they came together and they challenged each other to write a fantasy story that depicts the gospel. And J.R.R. Tolkien struggled and struggled and struggled while C.S. Lewis pumped out book after book and series after series. And J.R.R. Tolkien, he struggled under this task, and finally he came up with the Lord of the Rings, the trilogy that we have. And at the very end of that, a little bit of spoiler alert, for Gondor, this nation that is broken down, that represents Judah, at the very end, they get their king back. You see, there's an heir to the throne. He shows up, and Aragorn, he takes the sword, and he rightfully claims the throne of Gondor for his own. And there's this tree that's been withering in the courtyard, and it blooms again, and it's restored, and the people are united under one king again, and they can again flourish as a strong, powerful nation. You see, whenever we see this story in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, or whenever we see this story in Zechariah chapter 9, we know that it's the same story for us whenever Jesus returns. We have hope that we can have peace in this world. We can have hope that there will be restoration in this world, and we can have hope that we will be united as one front with all Christians in this world. And that's reason to sing for the King.